We're so happy to have you all with us celebrating Valentine's Day and Lunar New Year all together. My name's Sarah Litvin. I'm the director of the Reher Center for Immigrant Culture and History here in Kingston, New York. And I am just here to welcome you and share a little bit about what we do at the Reher Center before handing it over to our esteemed guests, Dr. Willa Zhen and Yin Kong. So the Reher Center, our name, it comes from Frank Reher, who was an Eastern European Jewish immigrant who started his life in the US on the Lower East Side, probably pretty close to Essex Market, where I think Chinatown hosts its kitchen classes. He moved to Kingston, though, in the early 20th century. And for 2 generations, his family baked and sold bread from the building that you can see in my virtual background. For 2 generations, the family lived and worked there together. And when they aged out of their business, they donated their site for the creation of a museum and cultural center. A group of volunteers worked for over a decade to preserve and stabilize the building. And today we are a storytelling institution that preserves and shares immigrant stories of the Hudson Valley, past and present, and offers programs like this one to draw folks together from across the Hudson Valley and beyond, and to have folks and give folks a platform to share their own stories of immigration, community, work, and bread. So that's what we're going to do today. And the conversation, the program you're about to see really started when Willa Zhen and I, Dr. Willa Zhen and I, we've been working together for over a year on all kinds of programs about bread traditions from around the world and the different culinary traditions represented throughout the Hudson Valley. So we started talking about a Lunar New Year event. And Willa recommended I reach out to the owners of several Chinese restaurants in our city in Kingston to ask what they make that's special to celebrate Lunar New Year. And what they told me was fascinating. What I learned was outside of major urban areas, they said, it's just not possible to have traditional items on the menu because they won't sell, right? Kingston does not have a very large Chinese population. It's a story that if we started to get into it, we would spend all day with it. We hope to do another program that kind of looks at that. But if you zoom into the kind of most personal, the family level, so many Chinese immigrants today have come to the Hudson Valley and are drawn to places like Kingston for such similar reasons as Frank Reher came here. They see a gap in the market, and there can be a small family business, often a food establishment, that will enable them to use the skills that they brought with them to serve the population here and to support their family. And that's actually the story of Kingston's oldest Chinese restaurant, which is called Eng's. It was opened in 1927, and there was actually an entire article in the New York Times about it last year, so look that up. But what's so interesting is that oftentimes these restaurants, right, they start to offer specific food traditions, but they have to adapt to what ingredients they can find and the palates of their local customers, their local clientele. That was certainly the story of Reher's Bakery as well. So once we sort of went down that road, then Willa and I came back to Willa's own family traditions and said, well, what's something that's really significant for you in the celebration of Lunar New Year? And that's how we ended on Fa Gao. She will tell you much more about that story. But around the same time, I had the chance to meet Yin. I had heard about Think Chinatown and admired you so much. But we just started talking and saw the synergies between what our organizations are doing with food and culture and tradition. And we were so excited to join forces on this event. So I'm going to just give you a couple last ground rules, and then I'm going to pass the session over to Yin and to Willa, who are really going to get us going. I just wanted to let everybody know that the session is going to be recorded. The recording will be on the Reher Center's website afterwards when we can get it up there. So you can come back and review it. And we're going to be sending the recipe out to everybody who registered afterwards as well. So if you didn't get the ingredients for today or you want to give it another go, you'll have the recipe and the recording to reference afterwards. If you have questions along the way, and we hope you do, you can put them in the chat. And Yin and I are going to be monitoring it together. So we will make sure to get those asked. And I think that's it, unless I'm forgetting anything, Yin or Willa. I'll just introduce them and then I'll hand it over. So Dr. Willa Zhen, wave Willa, is a professor in the Applied Food Studies program at the Culinary Institute of America and the author of Food Studies, a hands-on guide. She holds a PhD from the University of London, where her doctoral research focused on Cantonese cooking schools. And Yin Kong is a community-based designer living and working in Manhattan's Chinatown. Think Chinatown is the culmination of her work in urban design, museum, culinary, and cultural instruction, and community engagement. And Yin herself taught classes at Black Sesame Kitchen in Beijing. And as I had mentioned, Think Chinatown is going to once again be doing kitchen classes at Essex Market soon. So thank you all so much for being here, and take it away, Yin and Willa.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's great to connect with everybody also upstate, and I've loved meeting Willa here. And I have to admit to everybody, it is my first time making fa gao, so I am here as a student of the great Dr. Willa here.
Hi, everybody. Happy New Year. Happy Year of the Ox. I'm really excited to be here because I grew up in a Chinese community in California, and I have to admit, I really miss celebrating New Year with them. So it's nice having both, you know, sort of where I'm at now, which is in the Hudson Valley. It's not that upstate, but you know, if you're looking up from New York City, if you're looking up from Chinatown, everything is up. So it's nice to have a bridge between the two worlds that I grew up in, where it was much more Chinese and we had much more of the festivities for the holiday, and also be able to share with friends and friends all over. It looks like we've got joining here today to learn a little bit about, you know, some of the things that we do for Chinese New Year. And the Lunar New Year. So, and I use the term Chinese here specifically, even though people of various cultures and backgrounds celebrate this holiday. You know, it's called Lunar New Year to be more inclusive, but I'm calling it specifically Chinese here because this is a cake, a bread that's sort of particular to what the Chinese would make, and specifically Southern Chinese from this area called Guangdong Province, which is in the very southern bit of China. So I'm excited to share here with everyone.
Yeah, and you know, I'm here in Chinatown when I'm surrounded with like fa gao is like sold even by street vendors here during this time of year, whereas you might have to make it yourself to be able to get it. You mentioned the other day that just to get a roast duck, you had to drive all the way to Albany. So this is great. We're all self-sufficient this year that we're gonna learn how to make this at home.
All right, so I don't know how many people are sort of cooking along at home, or if you're gonna watch me do it and then maybe try at home a little bit, but I think if everybody's excited to, we're gonna get started in a minute. I think everybody's got the thumbs up here. So this recipe is actually really straightforward, but there's a couple of things that make it happen. And basically it's a lot about timing and a little bit of patience. And so for those of you who are joining from home, I'm gonna go a little bit slow to make sure that you have the time to kind of do things on your end, because I know it's sort of difficult to follow a recipe live. For those of you who are watching and then you're gonna try it out on your own at home, that's okay. You will have really good instructions and then you'll be able to follow along, repeat it at home. Without me, you will be experts in no time. So the dish we're cooking today, in Mandarin it's called fa gao, in Cantonese it's called fa go, and the term, the Chinese are really into these sort of terms that sound like something else. So it's sort of punny in a way. So in this case, it sounds like the terms for, you know, rising higher or, you know, more prosperity. And the idea is that you want to do better, you know, this year than you did last. And especially with 2020 and the dumpster fire it was, you definitely want to have a better year in 21. So the idea is that you have these cakes that rise up. And the idea is that by making them and sharing them with your family, you know, your fortunes will collectively all go up too. And hopefully it'll be a better year than the last. So it's a really straightforward recipe, and the things I'm going to recommend here can be, I live upstate, so I live in the Hudson Valley. So this is what I'm working with. The nearest Asian market to me is 45 minutes in either direction. So this is what I'm finding at my local Stop and Shop. But if you happen to be closer to a Chinese community, you know, definitely go to your local Asian market. The recipe that'll be distributed around and the one we're using can be, you know, you can definitely find these items at your local Asian market, and they're going to be with Asian brands. I'm going to highlight the ones that I found at my local Stop and Shop in Hannaford. So we're going to start with a couple things. You will need some measuring spoons, a bowl, and you'll need something to stir with, a whisk or a nice spoon. And we're just going to start with measuring. So it's really straightforward from here. You need flour. And the flour you need, first and foremost, in China and in baked goods in China, they tend to use flours that are very soft and have a sort of a softer wheat content. So they're not as hard, you know, flours you want to use for pasta or bread are a little bit harder. This one is a low protein content, meaning you'll get like a really silky, sort of soft cake-like texture. So the best approximation you get is what's cake flour. Softasilk is a brand you can buy at any sort of mainstream supermarket. Today I've got King Arthur, which is a flour maker that tends to do better quality flours. Both are fine. I'm not, you know, a food scientist where I could tell you the exact chemical difference between the two. And I just kind of bought whatever was available. So we start with a cup. And for those of you who are nervous about working with flour, there's a trick to it. I always like to have two bowls. And when you measure things with a cup, you know, you want to make sure that it's what's called a level measure. So you might get like this giant sort of scoop like this. The easiest way to get it really level and make sure you don't have too much is to take a knife and just kind of cut across the top, and then you've got a nice level measure. So 1 cup of cake flour, once again, you can use whatever brand you find. If you happen to have an Asian grocery near you, they will have sort of this, what's called like low gluten flour. That's a really soft textured wheat flour. That'll be really nice for this type of dish. So we've got our cake flour here. The next one is rice flour. And I think Yin has some advice about that as well. But rice flour is a little tricky, and I'll let her explain it first.
Yeah, I just wanted to show off the rice flour that you typically find in a Chinese grocer. So those of you who have the 20 yen box, make sure you're using the one with the red font, not the one with the green font. Yeah, Chenny, you got it. Because the green one is the one where you're gonna make the tangyan with. That's like a very chewy, kind of sticky feeling. And we want fluffy because, as Willa was saying, right, it's all about the homonym fa, and we want it to grow. So make sure you're using this red one here. Also, Willa, there was a question in the chat about would it be possible to replace rice flour with coconut flour or tapioca flour?
Those are good questions. So with the cake flour, right? It is a wheat flour, and I know someone also mentioned something about gluten allergies. So the Chinese don't really have a term for gluten-free cooking yet. So this recipe is built around wheat flours, and so I don't know if it'll be workable if you try another flour on it, in particular because some of these non-wheat based flours like rice flour or tapioca flour are really sticky. So it's going to make a super, super sticky cake. This one's sort of a combo of like a little sticky, but also kind of floury bready. So it's, if you try something like a coconut flour, which is going to be a little bit sticky, but definitely a tapioca flour, which is really chewy, it's maybe not going to be quite the texture you want. The rice flour is naturally gluten-free. Rice doesn't have gluten in it. There are versions of this recipe that are rice flour only. And I can include in, you know, the recipe that I have for today doesn't include an all rice flour version, but I'm happy to, you know, please feel free to put your information in the chat and I can send you the one I have. But keep in mind the all rice flour version is also going to be a lot more dense and a lot more sticky. So a little bit different in texture. And that's also the thing too, with the different flours is that different regions of China have different versions of something like this, and they'll have different textures. So this one's more like cupcake with a little bit of like mochi chew in there. There's ones that are super chewy where you're like eating mochi kind of a cake. So it depends and varies. So I hope that helps answer the question a little bit. With that said, So if you're able to get to a good Asian market, or even a mediocre Asian market, or just an Asian market, you can get the green and red bags of rice flour, and they're really not expensive. In fact, if you do cook with alternative flours, Asian markets and other sort of ethnic markets are really good places to buy it because the prices are a lot better, because they're part of the diet anyway. If you're buying like Bob's Red Mill, which is what I'm using here because I'm upstate, it's a lot more expensive for the product and may not always be quite even the same quality. Like I found that the rice flour from the Asian markets are actually a lot nicer to work with than this. So with that said, this one's just the plain rice flour, and the versions that Yin have, she can also show you what she's got, but they're not all the same. So there's the sticky one, or sometimes they call it glutinous or sweet rice flour, and then there's plain. So I don't know if Yin wants to show it, but.
Yeah, this is the glutinous one, the green one, and this is the plain, yeah.
Yeah, and I think someone mentioned something about like mochiko, which is also the sticky rice flour. So that's the glutinous one. So anytime you have like a glutinous preparation, it's going to be something like a mochi or a sticky rice cake, something where you want that like elasticity in the chew. For the one I've got here, this is more, it's got a lot less of that elasticity and it's got a little bit of sweetness because it's rice flour, but it's not going to be that really intense stickiness. And I believe that I think Chinatown is doing a sticky rice dumpling class towards the end of the new year. And that's where we're going to use like mochiko for that, or versions of it. Okay, so with that said, our rice flour here, we just use a little bit here. So there's different versions where like they're mostly rice flour. There's other versions where they're more lessly intense. So we're gonna do a quarter cup. And I admit I actually grabbed the wrong size measuring cups here. So I'm just gonna eyeball it. And that's the thing too about making these recipes is that we're at home nowadays. It's not always the best idea to go shopping at the supermarket, or it might be, you know, an extra journey to go out to the supermarket. So, you know, make do with what you've got. And the recipe that will be distributed really highlights that. Like there's a lot of substitutions and adaptations because that's the world we're living in. And, you know, the fact that we're here and together and celebrating is what matters. So if we have to change up things a little bit, it's normal. It's also the idea too that that's the story of immigrants, whether Chinese or other ethnic groups, that you just kind of had to make do and figure it out, and that's okay. It's part of life and how you get on with things. All right, so the next one up is our brown sugar, and I personally like light brown. Some people want a more like intense molassesy taste and they'll go for the dark. I think light works a little bit better for this recipe because it can become really sweet and a little overbearing for me, but that's my palate. If you want to try and get creative with dark brown sugar, go for it. And there's flexibility here. If you like it a little less sweet, half a cup is plenty. If you've got a sweet tooth, 3/4 of a cup is awesome. There's also this type of sugar that you can buy in Chinatown and in Asian supermarkets that looks like little, if you think about like what a domino looks like, you know, this little square thing, imagine like 3 dominoes stacked together, but it's brown and it's a slab of sugar. And it's actually called brown sugar candy or brown slab sugar. And if you're using that, if you happen to be near to an Asian market where you can get access to this, you'd need about like 1.5 sticks of this brown sugar if you're following with that, or if you're able to get that. Otherwise, you know, brown sugar here, what you get in the sort of mainstream supermarket, is perfectly fine. So the thing about measuring brown sugar that's a little bit different than flour is that you have to pack it in a little bit. And so I've got half a cup here. I don't have as much of a sweet tooth, so we're gonna go a little lighter. All right, so we're almost there. You notice we've got our 2 flours, our sugars. Pretty straightforward here. All right, so our next step is, and this is the super ingredient where this is what causes your cake to rise, you need baking powder. And this is where people get a little bit mixed up. Baking powder is not baking soda. It actually has a couple of other extra ingredients in it. But one of the things that you do have in baking powder is baking soda. So if you're only working with baking soda at home, try if you can to get baking powder. The other thing also is that if you're digging out a can of baking powder that has been living in the back of your cupboard for a long time and you don't know how old it is, test it first, because if your baking powder isn't active, meaning it's kind of like lost its fizzle, this recipe will not work no matter what you do. So I know this is fresh because I just bought this and I tested it. But if you're not so sure about that jar or can that's hanging around the back of your cupboard, what you can do is just take like a little scoop, maybe like a teaspoon or a quarter teaspoon, dissolve it in some water and see if it fizzes up after a little bit. If it doesn't do that, then get a new can or get a new packet. In this case, this is mine. And so what I've got here is we are going for just a little bit of baking powder, and we are going for 1 teaspoon. So I'm just going to kind of wing it here. So it's about that on my measuring cup. All right. So at this point, you might want to just give them a good whisk together and just kind of start breaking things in. And try to get the lumps out as much. And that's part of the trick of this recipe is you want to just make sure things are always mixed well, because that's how you make sure that they can actually rise. The last step is water, and you want some at room temperature. So I've got some here for me. And then you want it to about 7 ounces, which I know is kind of a funny measurement, but it's really easy to figure it out. A cup is 8 ounces, and the 3/4 cup line is 6 ounces. So somewhere in between, eyeball it. You don't have to do it exact. And if you remember high school chemistry, this is where your chemistry skills come in, because you can remember you have to read the line to measure your water. So I'm not going to test you on your high school chemistry line reading skills. I'm a little over. But if you're about there, you're good. So I'm just about 7.
So Willa, I used the dark brown sugar because that's what I had. And so mine is kind of clumping a little bit in the flour. So I'm still mashing.
Yeah, just let it, get it as fine as you can. Also, if your sugar's been around for a little bit, it might take a little longer to sort of soften up. And if it's got a little bit of clumping on, that's okay. You'll also be whisking it again in a minute once you've got the water in here.
And if you're using the brown sugar slab, then would you kind of eliminate some of the water that you'd be adding as well? Like kind of the aggregate water would be the same?
The water would be about the same with the brown sugar slab. It's more of the brown sugar slab. It's an extra step. You're also going to want a slightly different temperature water because then it'll help dissolve it down a little. But it's not going to be a lot more or less. It'll also be a slightly different sweetness because the sugar slab sweetness is more like a candy sweet. And this, someone who's a food scientist can explain all the different forms of sugar and how they have different sweetness levels and how they have different shapes. But the sweetness on a slab sugar is more like what you'd eat for candy, whereas this is more of like a culinary or baking use, and they don't taste quite the same. And there's actually a lot of different types of sugars that you see in Chinese cooking that for us, we're like, there's white sugar, there's like, brown sugar and 2 types and like sugar alternatives. In Chinese cooking, there's actually a huge variety and they're all crystallized slightly differently and they'll also have slightly different sweetness levels.
Yeah, usually I use the brown sugar slab to cook with, to braise meats. So for New Year's, my family has braised pork trotters. And that's like the first thing we do is we caramelize that brown sugar slab with oil before we brown the pig's feet in it. And that's you normally what I buy the slabs for.
That sounds really good. All right, so if you've managed to break it up, mine's pretty smooth, but if you're still working on it, that's okay. And it's also okay to use like a spoon if you've got that at home. I happen to have a whisk here, but a spoon is fine. If you have like a spatula, we're making do with what we got. This year is about adapting and being resilient. That's actually traits that are common of an ox, which is, this is the year we're celebrating the year of the ox. They're sort of hardworking, determined, resilient, adaptable, and that's where we're gonna be here today. So when you're ready, this is the magic step. Water, so wet to dry. So water into the dry ingredients and just kind of slowly swish it in. And once it's in, you're not done yet. This is when the work starts. So you want to really make sure it's well incorporated and get the lumps out. So you're going to be whisking this for some time here, and that's okay. You're going to get a good arm workout. You can switch arms too, or if you have a friend or a child or someone you can kind of rope in right now, get them to whisk it for you. You can trade off. If you actually have a mixer at home, don't be shy about using it. I don't want to assume that everyone just got one like in their home. But if you do, feel free. And you just want to kind of whisk it for a little bit to get it really nice and smooth. And part of this also too is that it helps get the soda in there and the baking powder in there. There's soda in the baking powder to do its magic, because what makes baking powder active is when it hits water, or same with baking soda, is that it needs the water to sort of make that chemical reaction and fizz up. And you want that because you want it to puff up and make this really cool looking cake. So how's everyone doing over there if you're following along at home? I see Yin is mixing.
I see a lot of great apron action out there. I'm into it.
You want to mix until it's starting to bubble a little bit. So mine's just starting to bubble, but I'm going to give it another couple of turns around the sun here. Has anybody got any questions? How are you doing? Are your arms getting sore? You're probably finding one really buff arm.
I have a question, Willa.
Sure.
So I noticed, when I have homemade fakao, it tastes really great, but it's not like super, I don't know, Instagrammable with like the puffing out petals and everything like that. Whereas the ones I see on the street or on, in the bakeries in Chinatown, they're so beautiful. But when you eat them, they don't taste that great. So what's going on there? What are the differences between those two?
Absolutely. So the ones that are made for the store, right, or you find at a bakery in Chinatown, they are often made with a lot of extra baking soda or baking powder even. And the idea is that they look really cool. And those are the ones that you might buy to give as offerings. And part of Chinese New Year and Lunar New Year at large too, offerings are part of the holiday traditions of this holiday, is giving thanks and recognizing, the blessings you had in the year past, but also hoping that, hey, the gods will also look favorably upon your family for this upcoming year. So you buy these really cool looking fakao that are huge. Some of them are like the size of like this bowl here. We can see how large it is. They're huge and they look really beautiful for photographs. And as Yin said, for Instagrammable. But to get them that big and puffy, you're not really making it for taste, you're making it for looks. Think about like when you see like wedding cakes in like a bakery shop and they look really cool, and then you realize they're just made with styrofoam and they're not actually real cakes. It's the same idea. So the really pretty ones are probably made more for offerings. And what you do is like offer the gods some nice things, sweets in particular, with the idea that, you'll have a sweeter new year. And there's all sorts of legends tied to that, but part of it is that one of the things you're supposed to do in preparation for the new year, and a lot of families don't necessarily follow this anymore, but there are certain gods you have to pay respect to. You're supposed to clean off the gods. Every family used to have little god statuettes at home and an altar, and you clean them off, say nice things to them, offer them food, and the idea is that they would, help bring good luck for your family. So this is one of the things you'd offer. Mm-hmm. And you want it to be really cool looking. The ones that like I grew up with, so I have to admit my family didn't really make these cakes, which you're like, why am I here then? She's been lying to me for the last hour. But what it was is that they were part of my traditions because there were always aunties and, friends of the family who'd come by and drop them off as like little well-wishing gifts, and of course there's a tradition of you don't go to people's house empty-handed. Today, if you go to someone's house for dinner, you bring a bottle of wine or you bring some flowers or something or dessert to share. Well, for New Year's, you bring certain items, once again, often sweets, but other things as well, to wish your family, friends, the people you're visiting a sweet New Year. So this is something that always got dropped off at our house by some of the aunties and friends in our circles. And so they were always there to eat. And I was the only one who really liked eating them. So that's why I have a very special fondness for them, even though my mother never made them. And my grandmother was a horrible cook, so nobody wanted to eat anything she made anyway.
Well, I have some follow-up questions on that, but I see some other questions in the chat. As Jennifer asks, is it possible to overmix this, especially if you're using like a electric mixer?
So if you're doing an electric mixer, I keep the time down. So if you're doing it by hand, it's about like 5 minutes. I think we're about that. With an electric mixer, or if you've got like the KitchenAid, I do it for like a minute or two and just whip it up. You can see on mine, there's a lot of like yeasty action going on. They're bubbling.
Oh, we need to mix more.
Yeah, so you want to get, well, not yeast, but sort of baking powder and baking soda in there as part of it. It's got the bubbling action. So you should see a little of what I call chatter, like the bubbles are chatting. They're bursting.
Something's happening in there.
Yeah, so you should see a little bit of it there, and it's okay if it doesn't quite get there. If it, just give it a little more time under the sun.
All right, keep going, everyone, basically. Keep mixing.
Yeah, keep mixing if you're not there. I'm about there, and it doesn't have to be like your whole bowl is bubbling up. If you got a couple, like I just pulled my whisk away, and a couple bubbles, like tiny little bubbles popped up, as well as little bigger ones. And I can hold my bowl up. I don't know if the light's good enough to see, but you can see that there's a mix of bubbles here.
Okay. Another question is, can we put in the vanilla now? And someone also asks about food coloring. Is it time yet?
Oh yeah, it is time. So the vanilla, you want to save until like you've got this nice bubbliness, because the vanilla actually sort of dissipates the more you mix it in. So you want to put it in right now, so you've got that really nice vanilla aroma. Same with the food coloring, put it in towards the end and then give it a good whirl until the color is incorporated. Food coloring and vanilla are absolutely not required. So the vanilla is sort of a more modern touch if you like that sort of vanilla baked goods aroma, which I think is really nice. If you're just keeping with the brown sugar, it's going to be a little bit more molassesy in taste, whereas with the vanilla, it's going to be more like molasses, that sweet, plus a little bit of aroma, fragrance from the vanilla. The food coloring, also not necessary, but a lot of people like to put a little red food coloring. And it's not going to be like bright red, like my earrings. It's going to be more like a gentle pink, like the color of this cake box here, or the flower box, where it's pinks and reds are really lucky colors for the new year. And so people sometimes like to have their cakes sort of pinkish, reddish color, because it's, an extra layer of luck on top of things. But it should not be like the color of my earrings or like this box where it's bright red. It should be more of a couple drops just to get that little light pink going on.
Yeah. Usually when we see them sold in a Chinatown bakery, it's like they have the pinks and stuff in there. And then, there's some questions about specifically how much vanilla extract to add.
Sure. So I've got this little bottle here. I've got the one with the dropper. Mm-hmm. So I just throw in like 2 or 3 drops, just a little bit. You can go up to like somewhere between 1/8 of a teaspoon or 1/4. It depends on how much vanilla you like. So you're not doing a whole teaspoon, you're just doing a couple drops. That could be 1/8 of a teaspoon or 1/4, just a little bit for,
Yeah, okay. So
food coloring, just a couple of drops, like 4 or 5 should be plenty. It should be a gentle pink. You're not eating anything bright red. It should not be this color.
All right, so is it time to let it sit now if we've had all the things?
Yeah, so you can see mine is really bubbling and getting excited to go into the steamer in a few moments. Yours should be getting bubbly and excited too. So what I'm gonna do is let this hang out for a couple minutes. I'm gonna actually set my timer. If you're still stirring, that's okay, take another minute. But I'm gonna set my timer for about 5-10 minutes. This is a good time to sort of pause. If you're at home and cooking along, wash your hands, clean up some dishes, throw it in the dishwasher. It's also a good time to start your steamer. So I'm gonna get that going. And then I think Yin has a few things to share about breads in other parts of China too.
Yeah, well, first of all, I was gonna follow up on my question about the difference between the bakery fagaos, which Amy in the chat was saying is kind of like the Chinese fruit cake, where you kind of pass it around, you don't really eat it, versus the ones where you eat at home, which is, this is like more like the recipe. So like what goes into the bakery ones that make it explode like that and also taste not so great?
So a lot of baking powder and or baking soda, sometimes a combo of both. Right? If you've ever made chocolate chip cookies before, or just any type of cookie, you'll notice that some recipes use like baking soda, some use like baking powder, or there's recipes that use both. And the ones that use both are extra puffy. And that's the idea, is that you've got double puff action going on, because one of the ingredients in baking powder is actually baking soda, sodium bicarbonate. So you're doing like double soda there to get it to do this puffy thing and rise. That's what they're doing to make it extra sort of cool looking. At home, you know, most people don't want to eat a lot of baking soda or baking powder because it's kind of chalky tasting after a while. Think about like, I drink a lot of tea, right? And so if you're boiling tea and your water's really hard, like ours is up here, you know, it's kind of chalky at the end. If you kind of pour in your water and you realize there's like that lime scale on the bottom of your tea kettle. I know nobody wants to drink tea now after hearing this, but you know, it's kind of that chalky taste. It's not really great. And that's the same thing with, you know, that extra baking soda or baking powder. It's just kind of like chalky. It's not nice. It kind of tastes a little bitter and salty and metallic at the same time. So it's not usually stuff people really like.
We also got another question from Helen. How liquidy should the batter be?
That's an excellent question. Think about a pancake batter. So like not one of those, like, you know, if you're making, like we grew up with Bisquick. So if you're making like Bisquick, right, sort of slightly runny, but not super, and not super gloopy. So this is kind of the consistency I can see here, right? I can grab it. So I've got my spoon, and if I pour it out of the spoon, it runs, but it's not super gloopy. It's smooth. I'm just gonna do it one more time. And, but it's thick. It's not the consistency of water or broth or anything like that.
I see. Okay, I think that's a pretty good example of how liquidy that should be.
Yeah. So I'm going to prep out my steamer. And for those of you who've never steamed anything before, just a quick FYI, room temperature water, just plain water, and whatever steaming vessel you want to use. So I've got a wok here, and then cold water, cold pan, hot flame. And that's really it. You want this to be at a full boil before you throw the steamer basket on. So I'm going to start that. I think Yin has a couple things she was going to share.
Yeah, we'll let Willa start the steamer, and then we'll also show a little bit about like what ramekins or what vessels we can use to pour the batter in. We want to have it try to be taller than it is wide, but it's also whatever you have at home. So I have these ramekins, which I'm going to use, which are wider than they are tall, but this is what I have at home. So we'll do are the best we can. You can also use teacups, or, you know, get creative. And they can be beautiful things that you can also use for your New Year's altar. Yeah, muffin tins might not be able to fit in your steamer. So you'll probably want something that has like an individual unit and where it's from. But so everyone, do your best. I think it's going to be great. For me and like my family, my mom tried making fagao like a couple times, and it's not really from her tradition. She's not Cantonese. And we never succeeded in making like the big petals. And, you know, it's kind of not the best luck if you don't have the most petals. So after a few years, my mom kind of gave up on this. So I was subjected to only the terrible chalky tasting bakery ones and the store-bought ones. So I'm really excited to see how this goes, but also I think we're all here for actually eating it, and you know, we're here for the taste, not for the cosmetic purposes. But yeah, Willa, you were saying how like in your family it was a thing that your aunts would make, and you would bring it around, and it was a homemade item. So I don't know, does anyone else from the group, did they grow up with their family making fagao at home and like bringing them out? I see some people are going to use espresso cups. Jenny's going to use espresso cups for her steamer.
So I've got some things here I pulled from my kitchen that we can use. And FYI, this is not actually my home kitchen. I'm actually here at the firehouse kitchen. My partner is an active volunteer for the fire department, so they've graciously let us use their firehouse kitchen, which I don't actually have an industrial oven at home and all that would be nice, but I'm not in that income bracket. So different things that I've used and with different degrees of success. So it'll steam in whatever vessel you've got, but ideally you want that big poofy like look. And so taller rather than wide. This rice bowl is a good example, right? It's definitely taller than it is wide, and it'll force things to go up. This one's a little wider than it is tall, totally okay. You know, this is the type of rice bowl you'll see, you know, in a lot of different Chinese markets and Asian markets. It's got that classic blue willow design. You might have one of these around at home. Standard ramekin you might buy, or, you know, make things like souffles in. Souffles, fun fact, also the same idea if you've ever made a souffle. When people do it, they actually wrap parchment paper in it so it goes up rather than out. Things that I've settled on, I bought these little silicone baking cups. Please do not feel the pressure to go out and buy stuff if it's not in your home already. Make do with what you've got. But these are little silicone like muffin cups. Somebody asked earlier about muffin tins. So this is what some people use instead of those paper liners for their muffin tins to get it to hold the muffin shape and to cook their muffins or their baked goods in. We're not there yet with our water. I hear it sizzling, but give it a few moments. So I like to use these, but you know, whatever you've got at home works. Espresso cups, tea cups are also good. Just make sure whatever you throw in is heat safe, meaning that it can stand the temperatures of a steamer because you don't want it to shatter. You don't want to injure yourself. Dealing with steam and hot things around steam can be very dangerous. So safety first.
I've definitely cracked some bowls before in the steamer. So yeah, definitely be careful with that. There's a question, do we oil the ramekins?
Yeah, so I've got, for me, I use, you can buy Pam or whatever sort of baking spray or cooking spray you've got. If you want to get a little festive here, and also if you're doing things like selling it or you're gonna give it to friends and relatives, a lot of people like to use these little muffin cups or baking cups and line whatever vessel they're using with it. Obviously that doesn't work so well with this, they're not the same size. But it works if you've got like this little muffin thing, the little silicone cups I've got, and these. And you know, reds and pinks, if you can get them, are really nice colors to include because they look very festive for the new year. If you don't, you can use parchment paper, or, you know, if I'm giving them friends, I use the liner cups, but if it's just for me, I just give a little spritz. Like I dropped off a whole bunch for Sarah Litvin, one of my test batches, and I put the paper cups on them. Because I thought it was nice to give it to her, but just a little spritz to coat it is plenty.
So Willa, there was a question about what heat setting the steamer should be on. Should it be on high right now?
Yeah, so we're a little bit far away, but you can see that the heat's on high, and for me, it's just starting to bubble up a little bit, and you want to steam it on high, because that also encourages it to sort of poof up rather than steaming it low. Yeah. The thing about the steamer too is that you want to make sure that there's a lot of water in there. You don't want to fill it all the way up to the top, but you want to get it to, if you're using a steamer basket like me, the water line should be just about hitting the bottom of where the steamer is, so the steam goes straight up to the top. You can always add water, but you know, as you're doing it, so if you find that's not quite enough, you can add a little bit more water and, you know, wait a few moments to try again. But you definitely want enough water there because that's what propels it to go up.
And also no peaking, right?
No peaking. So once everything is in, you gotta it's like making a cake or a souffle, right? The whole thing is like you can't peak or the souffle will collapse. This is not gonna collapse on you, but it's gonna lose some of its oomph because you just stopped its cooking process by opening the lid. So once it's in, you just have to hang tight, clean some dishes, ask some questions since we're here together.
So it's about 20 minutes once it's in the steamer. So just letting everyone in the Zoom know, you know, it's going to be a little bit longer than the hour we had planned. We got to make sure our facao's fast. So if everyone can stick around, it'll probably be a little bit longer than the hour we had planned.
Yeah, and if you're getting your ramekins ready, so our 10 minutes is just buzzed. So if you want to just spritz your ramekins or whatever you're cooking this on, this is a good time to do it. Oops, hello. Cooking spray is flying around with me.
I'm wiping mine with a paper towel and oil since I don't have a spray. Is that okay?
Totally works. Another trick is if you happen to have like a butter wrapper, So like, you know, butter comes in those sort of wax paper wrappers. If you happen to have one around, that's like an old time, like housewife trick, you can take that butter wrapper and just give it a little whoosh. Paper towel with oil on it is also great. If you need to, you can also just put a couple dabs and just swoosh it around. You know, use your fingers if you don't mind, if it's for you. And don't tell your friends if you're giving it to them though. But if it's just for you, nobody really minds. So I've got a couple different colors here. I'm gonna actually bring my steamer basket over.
So there was a question about how full should we fill the cups? Excellent
question. So what you wanna do, so I've got my steamer basket. You wanna kind of have your basket all ready to go and your cups not too far away. Okay. And you wanna get it to just about as close as you can to the top. So for me, like my pinky's about this big. I leave about a pinky distance but on my smaller cups. If you're using something like a bowl, you might want to leave like, you know, pinky as well. So you want to get it as close as you can to get up, but not so much where it's going to spill over. Keep in mind, I have to walk this from here to here. So I don't want to spill it in the process. Not to mention if it's too full, it's going to go like over and spill out when it's cooking rather than upwards and outwards. Yeah. So for me, like I leave about a pinky space, like tip my pinky from the top for a smaller one like this. And then for a bigger one, you might, depends on your bowl, a little more, a little less. And you kind of just eyeball it. There's no like real sort of art to it. Also for me, I like to use a Chinese spoon because I find that they're like nice and easy to put your batter, use to distribute your batter with, but you can use whatever you've got. For me, I find like it's an easy way to measure.
So we want a pinky's width from the top. Is that what we're going for?
Yeah, just about. I'll show you what mine looks like here. So, all right, so mine is about, you can kind of see the edge of it. It's almost at the top, but enough that where I can walk it over and I won't spill. And if it gets a little on your hands, you can just wipe your hands off. You can wipe off the side if nobody's there to see the drips except for you. And your water should be just about boiling. Mine is really bubbling at this point.
Yeah, mine's pretty boiling too.
Yeah, so you should be just about there. By the time you're done filling, it's gonna be the right temperature to go in. And once again, once it's in, do not peek. You just have to be patient here.
Gotta trust that your pho is gonna pho.
And the thing is also, it's okay if a couple of them don't quite turn out perfect. Those are the ones you eat first. And then the others you can give to friends or use as an offering or whatever.
All right. I filled one ramekin and one rice ball.
And you want to, once again, get it as close to the top as you can without spilling it. And I like to keep my steamer basket nearby, so that way I can just kind of plop them in. Okay. And I don't have to worry about sort of cakes over. So for me, I'm using these little like silicone cups. I fill about 6 of them. For you, it might be more or less. This recipe is also easily scalable. So if you want to double it and make more of these, that's perfectly fine too. It works pretty well as a doubled recipe. Especially if you're making sort of these bigger sized, if you're using like a rice bowl or ramekin, you might find that you want to, double the recipe so you make multiples rather than just one.
Yeah. There's also questions about the steamer options. Can you put 2 steamers on top of each other?
Totally. 2 steamers on top of one another will absolutely work. Just know that the one on the top basket might need an extra minute or 2, just because it's not the first in line to get the steam. So that you might need to move the bottom one out first and then take the top one out after. But it's not usually a huge difference if you're making it in the smaller cups like I'm doing. If you're using a bigger cup, then you might need to, take an extra minute for the top one.
Another person asks, are there alternative options for the steamer shown?
Totally good question. So if you don't have a steamer basket, or in my case, steamer baskets don't last forever. At some point, they go to the great bamboo forest in the sky. So they'll break. They're not meant to be like something you hand down to your grandkids. You use them for a couple of years and you need a new one, which is good because it keeps steamer makers in business. But what it is that if you don't have one, a couple of ways you can kind of get around it. So this is not the perfect way, and also be very careful. You can take like a ramekin or other sort of heat safe, sort of flat bottomed sort of bowl or something like that, put it on the bottom. I've also seen people take tin foil and make like a little like trivet. You can put it in the bottom there and then put a plate on top and then put your little cakes in there. It's not ideal because you are living a little bit dangerously here with all the stuff balancing, but you can do something like a ramekin or tin foil sort of balled up and rolled into a snake-like foil. That'll be the base of it. And then you put a plate that's heat proof on top. And then you can put your little, little things to be steamed on there. And that's a trick that you can use at home, making sort of the MacGyver version of steaming happen. For those of you who are too young to know MacGyver, it was a show in like the 80s or 90s about this guy who like would save the world from disaster with like a toothpick and some tin foil. Like he made do with whatever he had, so like make tools and equipment. So that's what MacGyver refers to, and that's what, if you don't have a steamer, make do.
Yeah, well, I will let Willa get her cakes into the steamer, but I love the MacGyver reference, but also I love the reference you made earlier about how, when immigrants make the move to a new country, how resilient and versatile they'll have to be to change up their recipes using the ingredients of where they've come to. And like, sometimes that leads to more tasty and interesting foods. It's fusion at its purest. I remember when I was spending a lot of time in China, and when I was living in China, kind of having to do the opposite, like trying to make Western food using Chinese ingredients. And, that was a fun challenge for me as well. So maybe while Willa's getting her cakes onto the steamer, we can ask Sarah to come back and share a little bit more about the Reher Center. A lot of us here in Chinatown or in the city, we haven't had, I haven't had the pleasure of visiting the Reher Center before. So, I know you guys are like really into bread. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that history and like about other programming you've been doing, Sarah.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's so exciting is we only opened for the first time in 2019. And we started giving historic bakery tours of this space and really learning about and sharing about the history of the Reher family and the other, the family who ran it, and then all the customers who came in, who were from many different backgrounds. The building itself is in a neighborhood called the Rondout, which is downtown in Kingston by the waterfront. And a lot of the industry connected to the waterfront had drawn many different immigrant groups, mostly from across Europe in the early 20th century, and African-American migrants coming from the South, and sort of created this multi-ethnic, multiracial, working class neighborhood. And this was like the local bakery and bodega, right? Where people came in and got their goods. But so what we've been doing is we're starting with kind of the shell of the building. The Reher family never made a lot of money from operating this place. And so the building really had fallen into some disrepair. So one of the things that we've been doing as we've started programs is raising money to build a bathroom to grow our gallery, because we've created this gallery in the former hayloft. In the early years, there were delivery horses who were delivering the bread. But as a part of that, sort of thinking about immigration and community and work and bread, we started working with Willa and her students at the Culinary Institute. She found us and said, what a cool institution you're starting. Let's work together. And so her students have been researching bread traditions from around the world. And we've been sharing out their research on our website. So it's been really amazing. but this was also part of the conversation leading into this project, as I said, hey, Willa, what about Chinese bread traditions? What are they? And we started having this whole conversation about different regions, that then when we met Yin, it was like you had all those other ideas and insight. And so that was one of the pieces that I was hoping you guys could share with us on this, is kind of like the great debate of like, what is Chinese bread culture?
Yeah. I think we've had some really great conversations with Willa as well. We were talking about all the different types of bread we have in the Chinese diaspora culture. And, something funny, we're like, is baozi bread? It's steamed bread. Does that count? At what point, because the cooking traditions are very different, right? We don't really use a convection oven to bake bread. So, but there are wheat products that are kneaded into dough and that rise. And in the north, they're steamed into like steamed buns, mantou, baozi if they're wrapped with meat or veg. And then I know like Willa knows so much about like the baking history as well, but like in the South, that comes more from the history of colonization. Willa said specifically from the Portuguese, like through Macau. And, that's where you get those sweetbreads that you'll taste if you go to any Chinatown bakery. You get these soft, mushy, sweet breads, sometimes it's like a hot dog stuffed in between. So that's kind of that really sweet tradition. But I think something that is a bit of an older bread tradition comes from Western China, with their culture coming from the influence of Central Asia. So, if you spend time in Western China, for instance, on the Tibetan Plateau, you have the Amdo, a Central Tibetan culture, who has a flatbread that is actually baked by being buried in hot clay. And it's like this similar culture, I feel like, that comes from other Central Asian cultures, where they are baked in like a tandoor oven, where the flatbreads or doughs are created into like this pancake shape, and they slap it onto the side. Actually the bakers get into these ovens and slap it onto the side of these ovens, right? And so the bread is like, the dough is like hanging off the side of the walls of these ovens. And so they're baked by contact, right? Not by convection. So that's like a very...
What kind of ovens are those? That like, is it something made out of some special material?
It's made out of like earthen, like it's like a tandoor oven. So it's like clay, brick, that the walls are like the main source of heat transfer. So kind of like, like a pizza oven is kind of built like that, but it's like even more of like a space that has more surface area that you're like using the walls to, or sometimes it's down as well. I've seen some people like hang over the edges to slap them onto the side of these ovens. Yeah, exactly. Ellen is pointing out like non-bread is exactly like the same concept, right? Where you're baking them from these like tandoori ovens.
So then it must have to get much cooler before you can like or I guess you don't like go in to get the bread out. You reach some utensil in, or like what happens after you slap it up there?
I've seen some really brave bakers out there. They have like cloth tied on their heads, and they like get in there and they just get it. And then you'll see someone will brush the bread afterwards to kind of clean it off. Like there's that like bit of a soot that happens from this contact baking. So someone comes with a cloth, and usually it's like the kid that comes and like brushes it off.
So interesting. I mean, so at the Reher's Bakery, one of the amazing things that we still have is the oven from 1916 that was left there. And so many of the folks who I've heard from as I've been interviewing folks, trying to find out the story of what happened there, are like kids who used to go and help shovel out the ashes or clean, like clean out pieces of it in order to have, because it was always a wood and coal-fired oven. So there's just like so many different pieces in the baking process that you never even think about. I mean, even just watching Willa putting this steamer together and all the different ways that you can go about doing this are fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how traditional cultures have come to create their own mechanisms to, create these staple foods. Now it's different, right? Like you can, for instance, that bread I was talking about before, where you bury it in that hot clay, you can kind of create something like that on a skillet. So you can do like a low temperature and put the bread on a skillet and like cover it on a low temperature to kind of create that same contact baking method, but with the modern stovetop. So there's some questions about after 10 minutes do we poke in the toothpick? No, I think we're not supposed, don't open the lid, anybody. No one should be opening the lid at any point. Do not open the lid.
Please resist temptation. The one thing you can do, I was going to ask, if you notice that it sounds like there's not enough water in there, please feel free to like add a little water. So how you do it is you just add it to the side. Don't pour it over the middle or the top. You just add a little to make sure it doesn't run dry, because that's where we have fire problems. And me, especially being in a firehouse right now, not a good example. So feel free to add a little water or adjust the heat, but do not touch this part.
Yeah, try to sneak that water in without opening the lid.
One question I had, Yin, was, we talked about what ingredients are available and how that affects recipes with immigration, but doesn't that also affect sort of regional cooking and baking traditions, even within China, for example?
Yeah, for sure. So in the north, right, there's more of the tradition of eating wheat products. So you'll get your noodles, the baozi I was talking about before, where it's the steamed buns, or even bing, the like pancake versions. There's a northern breakfast. My favorite breakfast food is a jianbing, which is like a crepe, but it has like an egg and like fried things in it, and it's super delicious, right? But it's made from wheat. Versus in the South, it's a more rice-based culture. So the same thing in the morning, right? You're going to get a rice crepe. So you're going to get the chongfen, which is a rice batter that's steamed in a sheet form and then rolled. Like if you have dim sum, you'll see that with like shrimp in it and rolled up, right? And so you'll see more of that. Even noodles, right, are made out of rice. In Chinese, there's so many different words for noodles. There's mian, right, which is like the wheat-based one, versus like fen si, right? Like that's like made out of like mung beans, or mi xian, which is made out of rice flour, right? So there are, so many ways to say. You can't just say, there's just no one word for like noodle. You have to specify what type of noodle. When I first moved to China, I would always get it wrong, because in my head I'm like noodle, and then like no, that's the wrong one. So you have to really be specific about what type of noodle. So like my mom's from the South, from the Hokkien region, from Xiamen. And so the type of noodles that they'd have down there is mi fin, or mi sua. And that's like this very, very thin rice noodle. If you ever have like go to a Chinese American restaurant and there's like a Singapore fried noodle, it's not a Singaporean dish, but it's that noodle, that really thin rice noodle. That's the common noodle we have in that area.
And Willa, did you have some book, some encyclopedia that could help us with this question about Chinese bread traditions?
There's not really a good one in English, I have to admit. But what it is that there are a handful of authors that have done really good writing about Chinese food. And I think the thing Yin and I were talking about it a couple of days ago is that, you know, talking about China is like saying the US, right? And it's so regional, it's so diverse, the landscape and geography is so very different depending on where you're at. It's like saying, oh, everybody who like is from the US must eat like New England clam chowder. Like, no, that's a very regional thing. Or, you know, everybody eats like pizza California style, or, you know, it's not, it's very much the same idea with China. And the thing about it is that there's variations on the theme. So Yin nicely pointed out that there's these noodle dishes, but the noodle, what it looks like, what it's seasoned with, what it's made with, whether it's wheat or rice, or maybe even like mung beans, totally depends on the region and what they grow in that environment, what seems to do well as a crop, as well as like what they prefer in terms of flavorings. So there's tremendous diversity in Chinese food. If you're in Chinatown or an area where there's a big Chinese community, you totally are able to see that. Because you'll notice that there's a lot of different styles of restaurants in Chinatown. And even the supermarkets, depending on who owns it and runs it, have slightly different ingredients or brands, depending on where in China the owners or the managers are from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like in Chinatown, right? I think for those of you who are not as familiar with Manhattan's Chinatown, we have in like the historic part of Chinatown, you have the more Cantonese Toisan cuisine. And then we also, on the east side of Chinatown, have the Fujianese cuisine, specifically from Fuzhou. And so that cuisine is more similar to what I was saying before about where my mom's from, the same province, where they have those rice-based noodles. And then we also have Viet Chinese in the neighborhood as well. And I think some of you are familiar with like pho and those also rice-based noodles. So it's interesting to kind of see the diversity and the different regionalities represented just in our neighborhood.
It's amazing. And I see there's a debate in here, or a question about if mooncake is a bread. Do we call it a bread? Is it a pastry? Oh, again, that was you said maybe.
Yeah, I'm gonna say it's a pastry. You don't really let it rise, right? Like what's going to be our boundaries, right? What's our definition for bread here, Willa?
You know, that's a good one to ask, because if you're talking about like a French style kitchen, so my students at the culinary, they're taught like sort of based in French technique, or European baking traditions, things that sort of make it more bread versus cake is obviously like the use of leavening agents, but specifically yeast, right? So other leavening agents include things like baking soda or powder. What a leavening agent is, it makes it go up and poof. So bread bakers, we tend to think yeast is their, domain, and also it's not as sweet, although you could have some sweet breads. And it's also the kneading and the technique, right? Cakes are more like sweet focused, and the techniques are different. And there's a lot more about like aesthetics in cakes. Not that breads can't be pretty, but there's a lot more design and composition and artistry in cakes, whereas bread, it's the staple of life, right? But those rules are a little bit different with other cultures and cuisines, where maybe those lines aren't as clear and sometimes are blurred. Like if you've ever had a chance to go to Chinatown and like go to a dim sum meal, for instance, or even go to one of those really awesome Chinese bakeries, a lot of those breads are actually a little bit sweet. And people might say they're more like a cake because they're sweet, or they have sweet fillings rather than like what we would think of as a bread, which could be like a really hearty sourdough that's more savory, or maybe even sour if it's a sourdough bread. But going back to the question earlier about breads, I think there's a list of resources that will be posted up later, but there's a couple of cookbook authors that do write a lot about Chinese food and the diversity in a very thoughtful way. And there are recipes for bread-like things or breads in them, and the different authors. I should also add too that, I part of my work, I'm an anthropologist by training, and I don't do the kitchen classes at CI. I teach what's more of the classroom courses, but I trained in a Chinese cooking school and studied how cooks train to become cooks in southern China in the city of Guangzhou, also known as Canton. And how they sort of divide it is that there's the people who do things with dough. So that includes dim sum chefs, people who make noodles. That could also include people who do bready things. And then there's the people who do wok cooking, meaning you're stir frying, you're steaming, you're boiling, you're braising. So that's how they sort of split like the division of tasks. So it's not really like bread, but people who do things with dough, meaning primarily like flour-based doughs, but it could also be like rice flour. And then people who do like cooking with the wok, like stir frying and all that.
All right, Willa, there's some chatter in the chat room. Some people's 20 minutes are up. So what happens when that 20 minutes is up?
Okay, if your 20 minutes is up, first of all, switch off your pan. so you're not moving things over a hot flame or just a hot burner. It's really dangerous. I've still got 2 minutes on mine, but if you're ready, switch it off. Make sure you definitely have dry kitchen towels or a pot holder or something, because steam is really nasty to get a burn on. So just be as careful as you can, just to not get hit by the steam. Do not open the lid yet. And what you're gonna do is transport your steamer over to where you wanna like sort of open things. And I'll also give you the run of the land too before you open. When you open the lid, don't open it towards you. I know it's very tempting, but push the steam away because you will burn yourself if you're not. So don't open the lid and go this way. Open the lid and push it out, please. Steam burns are really bad in general, but especially on the first couple of days of the New Year. You try not to have anything that causes bad luck for the rest of the year. So that's a definite like Chinese superstition.
Definite no.
Yeah, please don't injure yourself in any way. So make sure your burners are off. Make sure your towels are dry, because if it's a wet towel, you'll double burn yourself, and then transport to wherever.
Will, I have another question. Is there any sort of urgency? So if you've turned off the fire and the lid's still on, is that okay if you like let it cool down for a little bit?
You can let it cool for a minute or two, but part of it is that you want to like, it's going to still cook while it's still over that, right? Because there's still heat rising. So it's not going to be an active heat, but it's like taking your cookies out of the oven after like 10 minutes, right? If it's still like in a hot pan or it's still in the hot oven, it's still kind of got the residual heat heating it up. So if you need to like just let it hang out, just move your whole vessel over and just move your steamer out, and then just let the steamer cool somewhere before you lift out the lid if you're nervous about that. So I've got just a couple more seconds. I'm ready to do my thing almost. And I think most everybody's around the same time if you're still steaming. So I've got a couple of seconds. And also you might find that if your steamer cakes are still kind of doughy. So I've got my toothpicks already ready. You can use like a skewer, or if you have to, a chopstick, something that's just sort of pointy. Make sure it's clean though. Don't like use a dirty chopstick. And you can just do the cake test, which means you put it in about sort of halfway or a quarter way in. If it's clean, then it means it's okay. If it's sticky, that means put it back in for a minute, but it should be about there.
Oh, so we should stick it with a...
Yeah, so don't do it once again. If you're gonna pull things off the flame, make sure it's off.
I think this is go back in.
And then do things very carefully.
Ooh. Mine came out with a few petals. I had two different sizes. I had a smaller ramekin, and then I had a rice bowl. I think my rice bowl one is not done. So we're gonna try to put it back and see. I think we just put it back.
Yeah, if you've got a bigger one vessel, like this is huge, this is gonna take a little bit more time than my little tiny muffin cup things. So like a bigger one might take like 25 minutes. I'd start with like maybe adding 5, like depending on how sticky and wet it is, maybe like 2 or 3 minutes to maybe 5 minutes. All right, so I'm doing what I just recommended. I turned off my burner, just let the water cool. Don't try to throw your water out right now because bad things happen. So just let your water chill out, cool down, deal with it when it's not hot and scorching. Same thing here. Don't ever turn the ramekin towards you, always away, because nobody needs the steamer basket rather. Nobody wants a face full of steam. I know steaming is great for your pores, but not steam burns.
So should your test stick come out completely clean, or a little stickiness is okay?
The tiniest bit of stickiness is okay because it's also going to dry out a little bit once it's had time to cool, but it shouldn't be like gloppy. It shouldn't be like super sticky. So like mine, so you can see like mine's here's got a little bit of cake on it. That's okay, but you can see that the cake is dry. It's not like wet and gloppy on it.
I really want to eat mine, but I know it's too hot.
Give it a minute so you don't burn yourself. But these are what mine look like. I'm gonna put them on a plate so I can show off. So I have a couple that totally made the beautiful petals, and I had one that just was an underachiever, and that's okay. You may have a couple that just don't do as well.
I like how accepting you are, Willa. You're like, it's okay.
I'm trying to undo generations of Chinese parenting here. The immigration story.
I'm not used to learning like this.
The immigration story comes into play where there's certain parts of the Chinese parenting experience that I've keeping, but other things like, it's okay, we'll try again. So you can see that I got this one that's a little underachiever. That's okay. But this one definitely did what it's supposed to. So you're supposed to get that nice little like crack and that blossoming. I'll pull it up here so you can see that.
Ooh.
Ideally, this is what you're supposed to get. And this is also okay too. It's got the like little like split blossoms. The idea in theory is that you're supposed to get like 3 or 4 or 5. I've never been able to get more than 3, but if you use a larger steaming ramekin or a cup or something, you can get more petals because it's just more space to pull apart. Once again, this one didn't quite do it. That's the one I'm gonna eat first.
So, well, I also have another question. Like mine had a little bit of liquid on top still. Is that okay?
Is it like runny batter liquid, or does it look more like it's water from the steam?
It might be water from the steamer, but it's a little brown sugar color.
Okay. It might need a little longer in the steamer than if it looks like it's part of the batter. It just let it hang out for a minute.
But it already has 3 petals and it's beautiful.
Oh, if it looks good, then let it be. How's everybody else coming along with theirs? Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's got the petals. It's nice.
Yeah. So if anyone else wants to show theirs, we can, let's show it off. Let's see how everyone did in their class. I'm really excited about mine and I really want to dig in.
They're so beautiful.
You don't have to eat, give them a minute, but they're best warm, so you don't have to wait too long.
You can also, please take pictures of them and tag us so that we can see your creations. You can tag both at Think Chinatown and at Reher Center. Ooh, good job, everyone.
Those are looking good.
Wow. Hey, Amy, can I see your cone head ones?
I like that a couple people did the food coloring. You got some pretty
coloring. Love it. Good job, E, the L. Beautiful. Good job, James. Wow, a lot of first time. Okay, some people are still steaming. Well,
they're really good when they're hot. So, or not hot, but warm. They're gonna be like a sponge cakey, like chewier, slightly texture.
Some people are still putting it into the steamer. So I know some people have to go soon. So maybe I'll also talk a little bit about another kitchen class Think Chinatown has coming up for the Lunar New Year's. This is just one of the activities of Think Chinatown's series of events, New Year's activities from Chinatown. We're so happy to partner with Reher this time. The next kitchen class we were partnering with Essex Market and cooking with Ye, and we're gonna be learning how to make tang yen. So we'll be using the glutinous rice flour. So those with the mochiko flour can join that class. And so that class is for the traditional dish that we eat on the last day of the New Year called the Lantern Festival, Ye Xiao. And so we're gonna have that class a day before so you can, prep that and have that ready for the day of the Lantern Festival. Besides that, we have other classes. We have a Chinese dance class, storytelling through Chinese dance. We have a storytelling and pop-up art class so you can make family greeting cards about memory and Tuanyan, this idea of getting together in a greeting card format so you can mail it to loved ones you can't be with this year. So we'll also have, you can see in my background there, this giant lantern, wearable lantern, which is a work in progress. It was out during the first day of New Year, but it'll be out again on the 20th on Super Saturday and on Lantern Festival, where it'll be completed with its illustrations of what community means to us. And we'll be out there dancing in the streets with a couple lines that'll come out for Super Saturday. And we also have another lantern installation in the newsstand that we program in Moscow. So I hope everyone can join us for that. All of our activities are listed on thinkchinatown.org/LNY. I'll drop that in the chat. And hopefully we can all gather virtually, or if some of you can make it to Chinatown, we can gather outdoors, far apart, but together, and get, celebrate this weird New Year's.
And thank you so much to everyone for being here to celebrate together, and to Yin and Willa. What an amazing team. And I have gotten to learn so much just in planning of this. You can imagine how much more they have to share. So we may have to do more programs coming up. I also want to thank the Tivoli Fire Department for letting us use their kitchen, which was amazing. And Karen Levine, who's been our Zoom master behind the scenes, spotlighting people and all of that. So thank you guys. I hope you'll come up to the Reher Center too, and we'll get to do more programs together. So happy New Year, happy Valentine's Day. And if you're still steaming, we want to see the picture. So either hold it up or share it with us on Instagram. Follow us at Reher Center. And thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Happy Valentine's, Happy New Year. I hope it's a great Valentine's New Year for everybody.